Hello and welcome to another episode of Radio Warner. The date today is January 8th, 2026, and this is episode 572. I am the co-host, Mark Ames, in Western New York State. You are listening to Radio Warner. Subscribe to the show. Go to patreon.com/Radio Warner and support Radio Warner. I am on the line with the Warner, John Dolan, a.k.a. Gary Bretcher, in southern Italy. John, I think we're both recovering, but sort of ups and downs, strikes and gutters.
It was hard to get out of bed today. Yeah.
You have a flu. I hope you don't have this influenza, like, the one I described going around our house. Everyone is talking. In New York State, it's like at emergency level almost. It's
I'm just going to pretend I don't.
Yeah, take this one really. Hopefully, maybe it's already gone through your continent. I don't know, and you will not have gotten. I do not wish this one on most people, but there are some people I do wish it on.
Sure. I mean, pages of illustrations.
Yes. Like all the only thing I wanted to talk about, we have a great interview with Anya Parampil about Venezuela, and there's so much going on, but I just want to get to our interview. But the only thing I wanted to say was this ICE murder of a clearly scared woman in a car, just blasting her in the head. A 37-year-old mother, American woman. I've been talking about this on Radio Warner since early 2025. I think the fractures within MAGA that have been so interesting to me, because as somebody, who's written on the right and then who was part of that world to some degree, at least when I was younger, so I have a sense of it, I'd never really seen that much open fracturing against a sitting, like within the right, against a sitting, popular within the right president, or any, just in general, just against the sitting Republican president when he's there. And the events of the last 5 days, the invasion of Venezuela and the kidnapping of Maduro first, but then especially this ICE murdering this American mother, I've never seen such total and orgiastic enthusiasm and unity, complete unity among MAGA, whether it's, Nick Fuentes or, people who like to, their whole brand is that I'm not with Trump. Trump is a sellout. Trump's doing this wrong. Trump's doing that wrong. They're all not just on board, but they are reveling in it, like some kind of human sacrifice, orgy. It's really weird, man. And it's probably not the. I know it's not the first time
they wanted to see blood.
Yes, yes.
And now they've got the blood.
Yep.
Probably wasn't what they imagined, but it will do.
It will do, absolutely. And I think it's sort of like you're not going, okay, it turns out she was white. Okay, it turns out she was a woman and a mother, but you're not going to steal my joy. I don't give a shit, because this is what I paid for. In their minds, like this is what I paid for. Murdering people on the other side and watching the tears and rage on the other side, the helpless tears. That is what I paid for. They are loving it. And it goes across, like, even to the sort of people like Sohrab Ahmari, who has always kind of positioned himself as very much a critic of MAGA and Trump, while being a kind of right-wing populist with kind of crossover to the left and anti-interventionist. And, MAGA is too crazy. Like, he's come out and it's like they all got the memo that this is the thing in itself. This is populism, the thing in itself. Populism as imagined by right-wing ghouls.
Yeah.
So Yeah, man, this is just the start of 2026.
Yeah.
What a year
No,
this
they
is going to be.
they have a big appetite,
Yeah,
and this will not surfeit them at all.
absolutely. Oh, yeah, they're hoping for more. There's just
Yeah.
no doubt. Right. So let's get to our interview with Anya Parampil. It's a great interview and extremely timely, and she spent a lot of time in Venezuela as well. So let's get right to our interview with Anya. Okay, we are very honored to have with us journalist Anya Parampil. She is the author of Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire, very super timely book now. She's also a journalist at the Grayzone. So first of all, Anya, thank you for coming on Radio Warner.
Happy to be here.
All right, thanks. So before we get into everything, we need to talk first, obviously, about what's just happened over the last week or 5 days. Obviously, Trump invaded Venezuela and kidnapped the president Nicolas Maduro, and has now openly declared that the U.S. is going to run Venezuela like an old-style colony without the later 20th century gloss of democracy and human rights. And so the first thing, because you spent a lot of time and did a lot of journalism in Venezuela, both with senior leadership all the way, and down on the streets and so on, I wanted to know what your impressions are of President Nicolas Maduro, who is now in custody, what your impressions of him are, and how you think he is dealing with this situation, and he and his wife, because they were both kidnapped. Yeah.
It's interesting to try to analyze the psychology behind figures that we hear a lot about in the media, especially because, yes, I have met Maduro on several occasions, and I've seen him in the context of giving speeches before the Venezuelan population. I met with him in smaller groups of journalists at press conferences. I've seen him address U.S. activist circles, and more recently, or during my most recent trip to Venezuela, which was now 5 years ago in 2020, when I was there for the local legislative elections, or the gubernatorial, kind of local state elections.
Right.
I attended a meeting where Maduro presented to diplomats that were in town from Iran, China, Russia, and other allied nations. And during that meeting, he was showing off a watch that had been a gift from Diego Maradona, the famed Argentine footballer, who was a major supporter of the revolution in Venezuela up until his death. And so he was very proud of that watch and of his relationship with Maradona. But he tends to, in all these settings, we see sometimes, of course, him delivering the fiery political rhetoric, but he's a joker and he's kind of a gregarious individual. That's why you saw him, even when he was loaded off that DEA truck in New York and brought into the local DEA offices, he was saying good night and good evening and Happy New Year to the arresting officers and everyone present, because I think he was trying to show his personality as someone who's friendly, and he's not.
And then he's not cowed, maybe. I got the sense he comes off as a mensch, I have to say. I think even people who don't like him sort of were a bit charmed by that, that he comes off as a mensch. And is that kind of what you think is going on? Like, he's not cowed.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was part of his strategy leading up to this, was that's why you saw him dancing and singing "Don't Worry, Be Happy" at these public rallies in Venezuela, because he was trying to show not only is he not afraid, but he's not some scary dictator, the way that the media would like to brand him, or the way the Trump administration would like to have people see him as this evil narco dictator. Right. He's kind of trying to show his true personality. And I will just say that whenever I've discussed with Maduro U.S. attacks on his government, but also his life, You may remember in 2018, there was this drone attack
Yes.
when he was giving a speech in front of the National Guard troops in Caracas, and there was this huge explosion, things falling out of the sky, and we find out that the Venezuelan military neutralized what they say was a U.S.-directed drone attack on Maduro's life that had been organized in Miami. And Maduro later told my husband, Max Blumenthal, during an interview about a year later in Caracas that he believed that plot was directed by John Bolton, who was then national security advisor to Trump. But Maduro said in that moment that he felt divine intervention, and he always speaks very strongly about his Catholic faith, which is very important to him. And I'm sure that now, as he is in prison and facing this trial, that is something that is key to his, maintaining his spirits, because he will often just describe himself as a Christian man, and how that is very essential to his political and personal views.
This is a side thing, but I just have to get it off my mind. I remember when that drone assassination, that was really the first one I can recall. And I would feel like, especially after the advance of drones in the Russia-Ukraine war, that, I don't know, we'll be seeing more of them. But I remember when that happened, our old friend, blast from the past, Casey Mitchell, who was a big-time, disinformation warrior, always denouncing everybody. I've been denounced. I'm sure you guys were denounced by. He was like a Torquemada of disinformation. But he put out a big article, and that happened, and said this was disinformation, and that actually Maduro had done that, staged the whole thing himself. And anybody who says differently is a Russian agent or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that later in his memoir, John Bolton discussed that attack and said that he said it actually warmed his heart when he heard Maduro accuse him of directly accusing him of carrying it out. And he actually cited the Grayzone's interview in his book.
Wow. Yeah, you pull out some amazing quotes of Bolton and other people. He's such a pig. Once in a while, Trump does something good, and persecuting Bolton is a good thing. But it also sort of surprises me. Well, not a surprise. When you read him, he sounds like Trump. That macho talk. He's a lot more of a sort of. He's just very imperialist, macho about things. But he
reminds me a lot of right-wing academics who will assume this sort of very dry chuckle when they're telling you absolutely cannot turn in that late paper. You just have to get the F for it. Only he's talking about people's lives.
Yeah. So did you ever meet Maduro's wife or get a sense of her personality? Because it sounds like she might have... she was not cooperative, let's say, and that they beat her up for it. She's
never spoken in those contexts where I have seen her. She's not someone who's giving aggressive speeches to international or even communicating with the international media or anything like that. But she's always present. She's usually present with Maduro, and they have a very close relationship. And she's considered, other than Delcy Rodriguez, who's now the interim president, the strongest woman in Venezuela. I know that Maduro definitely, she and Maduro had a very close working relationship, and she's considered kind of his confidant. And what you would probably imagine a first lady in that kind of context, in out of like a romantic novel or something. Like they've been together forever, and they've been both very dedicated to this political project.
I mean, his background is that he worked his way up as a union organizer among bus drivers in the transportation industry, right? I mean,
yes.
Was he an intelligentsia? Does he come from more working class background or more intelligentsia background?
He comes from the political charged working class tradition in Venezuela. So his father was a union worker who rebelled against previous dictatorships. Maduro himself, yes, he worked as a bus driver and then rose the ranks of the union because, and this is according to a Mexican profile that I cite in my book, Corporate Coup, but the Mexican journalist says basically that he rose through the ranks because of his dynamic personality and charming character. That's the exact character that I, describe when I say he's always cracking jokes and he's very warm and friendly. You can see it in how he speaks that would lend itself well to a union leader role. But he had been formally trained at a youth political school in Cuba. So he does have formal political training in terms of how this left has been born in the region. He was he was active, and
so he has like a real leftist like bona fides in that way. If you've been done political training in Cuba,
right? Yeah. And he met actually when Chavez was in prison for his failed military coup in the 90s. Chavez initially initiated a coup. He was jailed for several years and released, and then in 1998 ran for president and was elected, and that's how the revolution was initiated in Venezuela. But when he was in prison in the 90s, Maduro was actually, as a union leader, someone who met with Chavez in prison and was one of the leading advocates for his release. And so Maduro was connected with Chavez back then.
So they go
he
way
ran
back.
For the National Assembly when Chavez ran for president. He was elected. He worked in the National Assembly all throughout the Chavez years. So that is also, before he became foreign minister, he had which is what he eventually became under Chavez, he had a long political career.
Right. I guess, the reason I ask is because there's this general sense, including in people who are very sympathetic, at the very least, very sympathetic with Venezuela and Chavismo, or very against, the U.S. imperialism. But there's always this sense that Maduro is somehow very different from Chavez, not as maybe talented as Chavez, or not as connected with the people, or somehow just like a bad Chavez, right?
Yeah.
And it sounds like it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, that he from his union background, I mean, he is a people guy, which Chavez was great with people from everything I've seen, whether it was speaking in front of the country or in like face-to-face meetings and stuff. He could really work a crowd. And it sounds like Maduro was sort of like, had that talent as well. What do you think what's your sense of that, and maybe how people connected or didn't connect with Maduro?
I think that Chavez was a once in a lifetime or once in a century leader of the Americas, really. There's maybe Fidel or the Castros before him, but Chavez, what he represented was so different also in terms, in some ways, of his approach to the United States. And just what Venezuela represents, is much more than Cuba. Venezuela is a huge, no offense to Cuba, but Venezuela is a huge power player. I should just mention off the top, the reason the U.S. is so interested in this country is not just because it sits on the largest oil reserves by far in the world. It also has the largest untapped gold deposits in the world and is filled with other minerals and rare earth minerals, lithium, things that are needed for future technological waves, and also the basic technology that we have known and loved for the past 100 years. So Venezuela is vital. During World War II, it supplied the British with 80% of their oil imports by the time the U.S. entered the war. And so there would have been no British military force in the Second World War without the support of Venezuelan, or their control, their monopoly of Venezuelan oil. So officials there tell me that anybody trying to control the oil now is doing so for future war. You cannot wage war in the next century without controlling the Venezuelan supply. So that's why I'm just to make the point of why Chavez coming in with his character and his coming from the military, able to bridge that gap between citizen and the military force. He would have these marathon television shows, even while he was president, a lo Presidente, where he would speak for 3 hours, sometimes walking through the streets, speaking with the public, sometimes meeting with his ministers, sometimes visiting factories. So Maduro, considering he replaced Chavez when
Yeah,
Chavez
that's a
died,
tough act to follow.
very
Right.
tough act to follow.
Yeah.
And also, that's when the U.S. immediately initiated its most intense economic warfare, immediately declaring Venezuela a national security threat. And I go through all the detail in the book about how the Obama administration began this medieval siege of Venezuela that broke it down. And, the government could have fallen then if it had not been for the fact that Nicolas Maduro was a leader that could consolidate Chavismo and hang on even after the death of Chavez. Because when Chavez died, the United States basically said, look, he's gone. There's no way this is going to last. The party doesn't have its namesake anymore. They're all going to fight between each other and there's going to be instability. And that didn't happen because Maduro was able to, he basically, there are other figures within Chavismo that fill other roles that Chavez that Maduro couldn't wear all of Chavez's hats. So, for example, Diosdado Cabello, he comes from the military. He's one of the main figures in Venezuela right now. He does this.
He's the interior minister, is that right?
He wears many hats.
Okay.
And he basically has this program called Con el Mazodando, which is replaced Allo Presidente, which is a 3-hour show every week where he comes and he rants and gives the party's agenda and mocks the opposition, mocks the United States. So there were other people that could step up and kind of play the part that Chavez did in terms of constantly having that media connection with the population that I think is so key to Chavismo, kind of these fireside chats that Chavez popularized. But Maduro, in terms of political leadership and economics, decisions to reach out to the East, build relations with China, Russia, and India. He's taken all of that Turkey to the extreme. And the key intervention he made in the economy that I think will go down as his major legacy was the introduction of CLAP in 2015 and 2016.
Right.
This was Maduro's answer to the U.S. sanctions that had basically dried up supply chains of key goods in Venezuela. There was a real threat of a famine and real starvation in the country. And so he initiated not only a crackdown on corruption in the food and agricultural sectors, but introduced CLAP, which delivered a box of basic household and food supplies to any Venezuelan household that needed it on a monthly basis. And this, according to even studies, a study conducted by an opposition analyst and economist that I cite often in the book, Francisco Rodriguez. He's opposed to Maduro, doesn't recognize the election that had the last 2 elections that saw Maduro declare victory. But even he admitted through his analysis that Venezuelans of all political stripes were given access to this program. 80% of opposition households that responded to polls said they received products too, even though the United States always would say, oh, this is just something they give Chavistas to keep them in with the government. But he also said that if Maduro and the government had not come up with that intervention, it is very likely that there would have been mass starvation in the country. And so Maduro has to be seen really as a wartime president, as someone who not only got the kept Chavismo on the path after Chavez died, or but was able to kind of invent new ways of combating U.S. hybrid war when it was deployed in ways that we'd really never seen before, in terms of diplomatic tricks and this trick of eventually recognizing a shadow government in Venezuela. And there were so many other moments that when the government was faced with more chaos in the streets, violent protests, the Guarimba riots that immediately plagued the country after Maduro takes power. We can talk about those and how U.S.-backed NGOs were responsible for starting these color revolution type demonstrations that really crippled the country for years in his initial, in his first few years in office. And yet the government didn't fall then. The government didn't fall during the oil crisis between 2019 and 2020, when there were massive lines all around the country and people couldn't pump gas. It didn't fall when the United States recognized a shadow government and actually encouraged that individual who was leading that government, Juan Guaido, to stand outside of a military base and call for an uprising. None of those tricks worked, and none of that pressure caused the government to fall. And that's why now here in 2025 or 2026,
I know.
I'm still getting used to that,
Yeah.
to that date change. It was just shocking to suddenly wake up in the middle of the night and found out that he'd been kidnapped from his home while he slept next to his wife, because it just didn't seem like the moment the government should have fallen.
No, I was gonna ask you about that, and I realize you haven't been in Venezuela recently, but I imagine you're still in touch with people there and have much better sources than most Americans do. Now, I don't know if this is the result of American boycott on news from Venezuela, but there seems to be a strange passivity almost in the population, or is it that they just didn't know where the blow was going to fall?
You mean in terms of how this happened on Friday
yeah,
night?
like the lack of resistance. Which of course raises questions about who on the inside might have helped give the game away and so on. And I would just add that was a really useful, thanks for that big answer about Maduro, because it explains why ultimately they felt that the only way to get him out was to physically have to remove him through military force, because they used every other weapon. And these
it is funny how they tried all the other approaches.
Everything. And we'll get into it, and it's a lot more shocking than even Anya has laid out, just sort of in outline form. And so what it says is Maduro is actually more talented than I think people give credit for. This is really, like when we talk about the CLAP program and what the U.S. did, these things, it'll be even more clear. But yeah, let's get to John's question. I think we have to, which is your sense that that there was an inside job of some kind? What are you hearing from Venezuelans about their reaction to this and what they think's going on?
So I woke up, Max woke me up because he tends to stay up a little bit later than I do watching the news. And then he decided that it was important enough to wake me up in the middle of the night and tell me that the U.S. had gone into Venezuela and they were claiming to have sequestered Maduro, and that he didn't think Trump would tweet something like that unless it were true. And so we spent hours watching local news and trying to contact our friends there to find out what was going on. And of course, my initial reaction is, how is it possible that in a country with Russian-supplied air defense and a unified military, as far as we're aware, and as far as I was concerned and what I knew about the country, very unified behind the president, how is it that they were able to get into his residence, which I assume was in a secure militarily protected location, and nab him while he was sleeping? It didn't really make sense to me that could happen unless there was some sort of stand down order. But as I've just brought those questions to my friends in Venezuela, including officials in Venezuela, by the time this interview is out, I believe we will also have an interview at the Grayzone with Jorge Ariasa, the former foreign minister, who is also now very keyed into everything that's going on, meeting with members of the government, working with Delcy to weather this scenario. He maintains that there was no betrayal and that the United States, through its reconnaissance, I guess it had been tracking Maduro for weeks with the presence of these ships in the region, that
Jack Murphy said the CIA had inserted teams into Venezuela as far back as September.
To monitor. And I mean, all of this definitely would suggest that there were at least major counterintelligence failures. But I've seen rumors online, for example, that certain military chiefs have been arrested by Delcy and accused of providing Maduro's location and all that. Those are rumors. None of that is confirmed based on what I have been able to get out of Venezuela. But what the government, their side of the story is that they were overwhelmed. They woke up with no power, no cell phone service, no ability to communicate whatsoever. And as a result, made a decision not to shoot down any of the helicopters or deploy air defense because they didn't want more people to die and they didn't want to escalate. Now, I was talking to someone yesterday, George Galloway, who said, well, that doesn't matter because if I'm a guy with an AK, I can shoot down an American Black Hawk if I really want to. But this happened in the middle of the night, and I think that the Venezuelan government is going to have to provide some sort of investigation or answers for how they understand all this took place. But definitely on the outside, there were people that began raising questions because from my American sources in the last few weeks, what I had heard from multiple people on the American side what's at the final deal that Marco Rubio had put forward was that Maduro had to step aside and allow Delcy Rodriguez to take power, and they wanted him to go to Turkey. And this was not something that Maduro was willing to accept. Now, the Americans that I spoke to, one of them even expressed concern about whether or not that deal would work because Delcy doesn't necessarily control the military.
I'm sorry, really quickly for the audience. Delcy is Delcy Rodriguez. She was the vice president, and we'll talk about her, and is now the interim president, or she's been named president. Yeah.
Everybody calls her Delcy. That's not just something I'm saying because I know her. She's referred to as Delcy by anyone who is covering or aware of the Venezuela situation, partially just because you can't call people Rodriguez in a country like Venezuela.
Yeah. It's like Smith. It's like Smith said. Yeah.
But even more so at this point in the United States, like you don't even hear the name Rodriguez is everywhere down there. There's no name that we could even put as an equivalent. But anyway, so she's Delcy. Her brother is Jorge Rodriguez. He's also very powerful. We can get into them later. But if the Trump administration is trying to basically come in and suggest that she sold Maduro out, that now she's willing to do whatever they want, and that she's handing over the oil. In reality, the deal that she's for example, the oil that Trump mentioned, he said that we're now getting however many barrels at this price thanks to Delcy. It was market price oil, and it was what Maduro had already agreed to do. Anything now that Delcy agrees to appears to be pretty much Maduro was willing to give the United States everything it wanted, according to public reporting on these negotiations. So I think what it came down to for Trump was that he just needed a trophy. He needed to he couldn't, even though the deal was there and he could have just had some summit with Maduro and signed an agreement and put all of this to bed. The Latin America hawks in his administration wouldn't have it. He needed to get Maduro out of office, even if the real regime change hasn't taken place. And so I think there's this disconnect now between circles in MAGA that I see that were posing as anti-intervention. For example, Matt Walsh or people like that who are like, Mike Cernovich. And they're like, I'm always against intervention, but this was awesome and this worked. And we got the commie dictator and we brought him to justice. Like, the government didn't change. This didn't succeed in terms of actually ending socialism or Chavismo in Venezuela. And any controller access that we get in Venezuela now will be up to the same people that were running the government under Maduro. And so I see also people taking this victory lap and saying, well, anybody who said that this was going to be another Iraq or Libya are wrong because we changed the government and there's stability, rah, USA. Well, again, no. That's only happening because we haven't removed the government. If we had, there would have been collapse and civil war. If we have to go in there and take the oil by force, then, you'll see these guerrilla warfare scenarios that people have been predicting play out. But at this point, there hasn't actually been regime change, and Americans don't really seem to get that.
Right.
So just to clarify something that's unclear to me, at least, officially, there are no American troops staying on Venezuelan soil, right? The kidnap team just flew in, flew out, and went to the nearest aircraft carrier.
Yeah, that's what I understand.
So let's talk briefly then about Delcy Rodriguez.
Sure.
Where does she fit in with this? Like, what's her popular base, or does she have that? Like, why was she elevated? What was her sort of career path? I mean, we talked about it a little bit when we did a short emergency episode after this whole event happened, and we talked about how her father was tortured to death by CIA-backed Venezuelan, intelligence police because he headed a sort of Marxist guerrilla movement, and they blamed him for the kidnapping of an executive at what's that glass company, Owens something,
Illinois,
right? Which comes up again in your book. And so so that's her background. Is her father, who was a Marxist, was tortured to death by the CIA's right wing intelligence proxies or whatever, allies. So does she come from like straight Chavismo? Has she come from like a more radical because I know that Chavismo also is a kind of a coalition of groups from the left, and not all of the left, but most of the left, and so on. Yeah,
I would say she's as straight Chavismo as you can get. I mean, she's 56, so she was relatively young when you think about all of this happening in the last 20 years. So she entered she gets into politics around the time of the coup against Chavez in 2002, and pretty quickly rises the ranks of the government because she's just a very effective and powerful, commanding woman. Like if you meet her or you see her in action, she just has a certain attitude about her, and she's a very effective communicator.
You've met her?
Yeah, I've met her again several times. Actually, she is a very competitive ping pong player. This is something that I know about her based on my interactions with her. She has a real Chinese trainer that she trains with regularly, and she often is like playing ping pong with people that are in town, whether it's the Chinese diplomats or like she has a whole, she and her brother, they have it set up in the economy ministry when she was the economy minister, like a whole ping pong area for them. And so
cool.
But she's like very adept at it and into it, and that's kind of how you can see her addressing ministers or political gatherings as well. Just very fast and kind of aggressive, but in a way that I know it's kind of tricky to be a woman in politics. But we were talking yesterday in this interview with former Foreign Minister Jorge Ariasa, and he said that when he first saw Delcy in action as foreign minister, she was in there as a lady, and there were 9 men working as her vice ministers below her, and she'd be in this room with 9 men, and she'd be in charge. And he said even none of them could stand up to her because she was worth 10 of them. That was his way of putting it. Like that's why. I mean, she's a very fiery individual, and she, in her own way, had gained a lot of power in the government, even when Maduro was in power. So over the last few years, she was not only acting as vice president, she was acting as the economy minister. She recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, took over PDVSA, the state oil company, as well, leading PDVSA. Her brother is the government spokesperson, high-level ranking official in the National Assembly. Her brother is often leading negotiations with the opposition. Once I was there, he was coming from a ping pong match and going to meet with one of the leading opposition figures, Enrique Capriles, to kind of hash out a negotiation. But whenever there were talks in Mexico between the United States and Venezuela, her brother is the one typically leading those talks. And so the two of them, very powerful, perhaps, I mean, other than Maduro, the most powerful people in the country even before this change took place. So again, there's no regime change. Delcy was already running much of the show alongside Maduro. And it's not surprising, I think, from the Venezuelan or Chavista standpoint, then, that she is leading the country. She's someone that Venezuelans and Chavista Venezuelans would expect to be leading right now. It's not a shock. It doesn't feel as if the military or some other force came over. She is the natural political successor.
Sorry, but I remember the initial reaction on social media in, pro-Venezuelan sources, which was, they left her free. They would have captured her or killed her if she'd been a serious threat of maintaining Chavismo. But I gather that's you don't really buy that.
I think if they'd taken out more than Maduro, then you'd be dealing with a power vacuum and potentially a devastated country at war. And I don't think the United States wanted that scenario. In some ways, I see this as a safe phasing move by Trump, because now we can say Maduro is out, and perhaps he'll even start lifting sanctions and doing business with Delcy just to say that because as far as is concerned, he can declare mission accomplished with the U.S. public. It's not about dislodging Chavismo, because Chavismo will make deals with them. And Maduro was a scalp that Trump wanted to collect. But I think they, as the Trump administration, this is interesting, actually. They've accepted that the opposition that they've supported all these years is no longer viable. In fact, the rallies that we saw all throughout London and Madrid and Miami and New York kind of demonstrate that their base left the country over the last decade. Those people that used to go out in the streets and riot for the Venezuelan opposition are now living in our country. And so they don't have a popular base on the ground. If they did, after the last election in 2024, when Maduro was on shakier electoral grounds, there would have been riots. There would have been protests.
That's the first
like
time you might have
past.
Actually lost, but there was nobody there to take advantage of that. Unlike the other ones that he actually won, and they rioted to try to
exactly. And all Maria Corina Machado, they gave her the Nobel Prize as kind of her ticket out. Now she may have been expecting now to ride back on a U.S. military jet, but it didn't happen because they know that if they forced those people in, there would be a civil war in the country. They would have to go through the violent process of really extracting Chavismo from every aspect of the society and economy, and it would be
and that would mean mass
ugly.
Migration again.
Yeah.
Right.
And so they kind of played the Venezuelan opposition. And from what I'm hearing, based again on sources on the U.S. side, part of that is the fact that it took these Cubans, Marco Rubio and Mauricio Claver-Carrón, to sell out the Venezuelan opposition because they're like, okay, screw you guys. We can just make this little deal in Venezuela that is still going to possibly have the effect of cutting off the Cuban regime. And that's all we care about. All we care about is hopefully angling now to weaken Cuba.
Because
they
Venezuela
don't care whether
supplies Cuba with oil. Right?
Yeah, and they think that if they can get in there and weaken Venezuela or open Venezuela up in any way, that's just part of their attack on Cuba. They don't actually care whether or not Maria Corina Machado is running the game. And so again, it comes down to this ethnic political rivalry playing out in the U.S. And of course, that's played a big role in all of this, is how they use these migrant groups to pressure our politicians into making these policies to begin with. Because I don't think it would be this extreme from Trump if it weren't for the radical Cuban Miami coalition. Then I think it might have been possible that he would have just made a deal with Maduro. But as long as we live in Paul Singer's world and the Miami Florida, we're beholden to the Miami mafia, this is the kind of policy we get in Latin America.
Right. Also, one more thing I wanted to say, because I listened to an interview. Max was talking also about Delcy Rodriguez. He said that during COVID, she became kind of like the daily voice talking about, what should be done in government, like kind of the Fauci. I mean, it's obviously a bad analogy, but like the person that people got to know during the COVID,
That's
like
true.
fear and panic. And so she also kind of established a rapport with the with the populace that way. Like they all know her through that as well. Is that right?
They definitely, as I said, in the worst case scenario for them where Maduro is removed from power, this would be the natural outcome. It's not as if there's some internal Chavista coup that is taking place or there's any... They immediately came in and brought in the vice president. That's just what's supposed to happen.
Right. And the Trump world's idea is, I think the idea is from the political marketing polling point of view, everybody, personalizes enemies. So Maduro is the enemy. So if you've removed Maduro, you have a trophy. And nobody knows in this country who Delcy Rodriguez is.
Right.
And I would bet also that all of their intelligence sources, I know this is how they talk about everybody they don't like on the left or like Hamas. They always say, X doesn't care about their ideology they profess to. They're all completely cynical people.
Yeah.
You can do deals with, right? And so they probably say, well, Delcy, they only care about making money and blah, blah, blah. They don't believe in, Hamas doesn't care if Palestinians die. They all talk that way.
Right.
So they probably convinced themselves that, that they can work better with Delcy Rodriguez after scaring them, putting the fear of God in them through the raid. It's very mafia. I mean, it's just very, very mafia-like. Like, take out the top and then put a gun to the head of the next person and say, if you don't cooperate, we blow your brains out.
I will just say about Delcy, though, I have sources on Wall Street, the American financiers over the years that they respect her. Like there are people that I've been in contact with who have been going to Venezuela, meeting with her personally and trying to even lobby the United States to lift sanctions. She was the point person for individuals like that. And so, and I'm not trying to say that makes her a sellout. I think that that's probably good for Venezuela at this point. I'm not some purist who's like, they can never have relationships with Wall Street. Like they obviously need to.
That's
and should.
reality.
And the
power.
fact that, and the fact that she has maintained this level of respect with all sides, whether, I mean, like I said, the Chinese, the Russians, she's as vice president, she'd be going to Moscow, she'd be going to China, having these high level meetings on behalf of the government. And she, of course, was foreign minister as well in the past. So she has all those international connections, but she also with the rising multipolar world, but she's also maintained good relationships with people in the United States. And so again, I think that's a positive and,
So they think she's somebody who they might not agree with, but she's just a serious person, and they think that Corina Machado is just not a really serious person who could actually manage that country.
And Delcy's sounds like Delcy's not going to wage some dirty war to like actually remove the political project. She's part of the political project, and I guess the United States, after all of these years, realized they weren't going to dislodge it. Like you said, they tried everything. So they just had to go in there and get their trophy, say they changed the face, and now they can play ball. Now they can lift the sanctions. Now they can say, oh, look, Venezuela is a success story. And Trump can even claim that his little regime change operation, quote unquote, was a success, which is which I think is, not great. But for Venezuela, it is better that it played out in this way than something more aggressive.
Right. So I don't know, John, if you had any more questions about the current situation, because it's so, I mean, this has all been really helpful. And I do want to talk about some of the parts in your book, too, to give a sense of this long war, basically, by the U.S. on Venezuela that's been going on.
Well, I mean, I guess that's the real question. Like, there's a big part of the U.S. aggressive foreign policy institution. As you say in your book, it survives for generations. It's not just one group of people making policy. These policies survive and they form a kind of malign instinct. So there was a lot of military momentum against Venezuela. Do you think that's going to be tamped down now?
Yeah, I think Trump is trying to declare mission accomplished and basically say that he achieved his goal there. And he'll say that he's controlling the country and that he's running it, even if he's not. What Jorge Arias told us during his interview with Max last night was there's been no regime change. And so they can say what they want. And yes, the U.S. had already reached, or Maduro was willing to reach a deal with the U.S. where they opened up and did some trade. So if that's happening now, it's not evidence that the U.S. is telling them what to do. It's just evidence that they are pretending like they changed the government in order to get the deal that they already had on the table. So it's kind of cynical. I mean, very cynical in that way. But the U.S. did, I think, part of what I write about in the book a lot is just why Venezuela is a target, even just beyond the oil. Because look, the oil, as I said, we could have gotten this deal with or without Maduro in power. If he were there, we still could have gotten the oil that Trump bragged about getting yesterday on his Truth Social. So why did they target them so much? And I really feel that part of it is that because of U.S. pressure and sanction policy, not only was Venezuela's oil industry broken down, and so they were producing less, but the oil that they were selling, they were no longer selling in the dollar. They were cut off from the dollar, and so they were selling oil in rubles and in gold-backed loans and in Chinese currency. And so Venezuela was really threatening like the basis of the petrodollar system itself. And
had
I
to
think
work
that's
outside of it, basically.
Yeah. And so I think that's once you're doing that at such a high level in the Western Hemisphere, it's no surprise that the Navy rolled in the way that they did. And that's, to me, I mean, that people are like, what is the U.S. empire based on? And there it is. I mean, they obviously posed a threat to the financial system.
Hegemony and everything. Right. Yeah, and you can't have that in your hemisphere. Russia's doing that too. And let's talk a little bit about, I mean, your book again reminds us that the joke that was Juan Guaido. He's now a meme, you know. I mean, Guaido eventually just became a meme. And I kind of wonder also if that experience, because that was all Trump won, pretty much, and that experience was such a failure, except maybe from the point of view of maybe some corporations or people suing Venezuela. But as a rule, like, it turned out to be such a joke that maybe Trump too is just sort of like, you know, these opposition people are a joke. Let's try something else. But could you talk about a bit about Juan Guaido and like how the Guaido experiment or whatever fell apart, like maybe the Live Aid concert and some of that stuff?
Guaido himself really is the least significant figure that came from his regime, you could say. He was just this young, ambitious guy. He was put into that position when he came out of a youth student movement that was active in the streets in 2007 in order to protest Chavez's attempt to amend aspects of the Constitution through a national referendum. So there was a ballot, and in the lead up to the vote, these students went out in the street, rioted.
Backed by USAID, right?
Backed by USAID, and there's not just by USAID, but they were trained by OATPOR, which I'm sure you guys have covered. The group that had basically perfected this color revolution, a new generation of regime change that came out of Serbia, and then they created OATPOR as this group to basically train the next.
It's like color revolution management consultants.
Exactly.
So they had, as you say in the book, they became a cadre which could go around the rest of the world and then train everybody with their secret expertise.
Yeah, so they would do training groups with people from actually all over the world, not even an exaggeration.
Yes.
Thailand, Iran, Venezuela, like you name the country, they have trained people, and then they dispatch them back to their own homelands to kind of carry out this script that we've seen play out time and time again in Ukraine, and we see it now in Iran. And so these students, we know all about the relationship between Otpor thanks to WikiLeaks and the Stratfor leaks that came out and detailed how close they were. In fact, the head of Otpor even bragged about knowing Juan Guaido right after he was installed as this shadow president. What happened in 2019 is Trump selects, or the Venezuelan opposition coalesces behind Juan Guaido, make him Speaker of the National Assembly in Venezuela. Even though he wasn't in line, he was a nobody. No one, even in the opposition, many people were confused about why he was put up and selected for that position. And then Trump turns around and recognizes him as the president of Venezuela based on a loose interpretation of the Venezuelan constitution that says if the president has vacated power, the president of the National Assembly becomes president. And they were just saying, well, we no longer recognize Maduro, so we have to recognize this guy. And on its face, it was an absurd policy because Guaido never controlled anything in Venezuela, not one ministry, not one animal control unit, but he was riding around on his motorcycle for a while, riling people up, trying to get, they had these huge mass demonstrations that I attended of the opposition in the streets where he spoke openly. I mean, imagine a parallel situation in the United States where Russia recognized Kamala Harris or Nancy Pelosi as the president, and then they're running around outside of military installations agitating for an uprising to overthrow Trump. Yeah. I'm just trying to imagine how that would have played out in the United States. I don't think that I would have been able to just stand in a peaceful rally of Kamala or Nancy Pelosi supporters the way that I did in Venezuela, because those people were just allowed to continue agitating even after this direct act of aggression, recognizing a shadow government, had taken place. And so this is February 2019. This is the time that I first went to Venezuela, when I had been working for RT and abruptly lost my job there. That's probably a story for another book. And another colleague of mine, Aaron Mate, had been working for a kind of a indie media outlet that has since pretty much folded. And we were both out of a job. Max was trying to figure out a way to get us all working together at the Grayzone. And so we were like, we've all been interested in Venezuela. Let's go there, because now things have gotten so crazy. This would be an interesting time to go and cover the situation. Max and I speak Spanish. We thought, let's go see this place that we've heard all about all these years and see what we can find out. And it ended up just being kind of the trip of a lifetime, because it was it was a moment in history where it felt like any day war could break out. And once we got in and were able to meet with government officials and get a sense also of what it was like on the ground, it was just a completely different picture than what we'd been told in the United States in terms of just like, first of all, they were telling us that there was no food, that people were starving. And at that time, it wasn't even the worst moment in their economic crisis. They'd kind of gotten out of that, and there was food, there was toilet paper on the shelves of the grocery stores. And so we were able to start combating the narrative about, starving Venezuelans eating their animals in the street. But also, we were there when the U.S. pretty much attempted a military invasion of Venezuela that you referenced, Mark, with the Venezuela Live Aid concert that took place at the end of February. This was just a wild time. Pretty much what happened is after the U.S. recognized Guaido, they set up this military installation along the Colombian border with U.S. military trucks that they said contained aid. And they said the people in Venezuela were starving and so desperate that they needed to ram these aid trucks across the border if the Venezuelan government wouldn't accept the aid themselves. And so it was kind of this, it had two goals, this stunt. It was to intimidate the Venezuelan military, basically say, here we are, we're coming for you. So if any of you want to defect, the time is now. And Maduro and Trump Bolton and Trump made public statements to that effect, basically saying, if you're in the Venezuelan military, the time is now. Like, come to our side because we're about to come and mess you up. And the second goal was to paint this picture of an evil dictator who was so careless that he didn't even want to accept the good American aid that we had just stationed there.
His people so much is willing to starve them to death.
Yeah. Even though we're begging to give him this food.
Not just his people, but his dogs.
Yeah. Just to give you an idea of why the Venezuelans maybe weren't so enthusiastic about that aid, though, is that Trump's Venezuela envoy at the time was Elliot Abrams, who was most famous for using aid deliveries in Nicaragua in order to run guns to the Contra militias and fuel the civil war there against the Sandinista government. I mean, that was his playbook. So kind of basically telling Venezuela right off the bat, you don't want these trucks at a time like this. But on top of that, the UN, the Red Cross, none of these humanitarian groups were involved in the procurement or distribution of the aid. So the Venezuelans, they saw it as a Trojan horse. They saw the effort to push this aid across the border as a military invasion. And so who comes along to give popular support, or at least the appearance of popular support to this stunt, but Richard Branson, the CEO of Virgin Mobile. And for whatever reason, he decides that this is his cause and that he's going to construct a massive concert venue and put together this Venezuela Live Aid performance where he shuttled in performers like a reggaeton and ballad singers from all around the region to have a big concert and celebration just a few miles away from where the U.S. military trucks were gathered. And it ends up just becoming a complete, I don't want to swear.
You can say shit show if you want.
I try to speak like a lady, but they have this concert. Guaido can't even get on stage because they're so afraid of him getting like sniped from the air. I'm not even sure, because what they had done is actually, it came out later that Maduro had put out a freeze on all of Guaido's international travel. I mean, they didn't arrest him, but they at least said, okay, you can't go anywhere if you're going to pretend that you're president and you're running around running this coup attempt. It later came out that Guaido got across the Colombian border because he was smuggled over by Colombian narcos. And he was actually photographed with them. They posed with him crossing the border. And months later, those pictures came out and were published in The Guardian and elsewhere. But Guaido comes to this concert and he's there with all these opposition figures and regional allies such as Luis Almagro, the head of the OAS, who basically changed that organization into an instrument of U.S. policy in the region, and also the president of Chile, other regional allies of the United States. They come and have this big party on the border. And what happens with the aid? Within a few hours, it's all on fire. And so we're in Caracas getting these images of these the U.S. military aid trucks erupted in flames, trying to figure out how exactly this could have happened. The U.S. immediately accuses Venezuela of somehow firing on the aid and lighting it ablaze. And in the end, Max basically spent that whole evening piecing together information that was publicly available online to show that there were videos of masked thugs on the Colombian side of the border lighting those trucks up and throwing Molotov cocktails on them. And basically it looked like a bunch of guarimberos, like the rioters that have appeared in Venezuela's streets backed by the United States all these years, suddenly had popped up in Cucuta in Colombia and carried out this stunt to make it look like the Venezuelan government was retaliating against the U.S. military. And
Burning
eventually,
food aid when its own
yep.
population is starving. Have you ever seen such horrors? Yeah.
And then in the end, even the New York Times
Yeah, I remember that
verified.
because Max, I think, was the first one to break that and probably got called a tanky, every time you break something. And then eventually the New York Times, without attributing, of course, because they never do. And months later, as I recall. Yeah, right. Yeah.
A month later, they admitted the opposition burnt its own aid. But then not only that, I mean, that chapter of Venezuelan history was just so illustrative of how the whole dynamic worked, because not only did they do that fake stunt to blame Maduro, and then eventually, it all comes true that it was fake. They then, on the opposition side, all get busted for massive corruption. Months later, the opposition, opposition outlet, like an anti-Maduro outlet based in Miami, actually published an expose revealing that the Guaido officials in Cucuta, in Colombia, who were tasked with managing the refugees that had come across the border and basically that had been lured across the border by the opposition and by the U.S. government, who were there saying, like, come and get your aid and we're here to protect you. Now's the time to defect from the government. All months later, after the concert was wrapped up and after the dust or the ashes of the aid had settled, these guys were still there, basically in drug gangs and in the streets, completely impoverished, asking, well, where did all of our aid go? And there were 2 Guaido officials who were tasked with distributing aid and funds that had been raised around that Live Aid and USAID incident. And they had basically spent all the money on fancy clothes, hotel rooms, partying.
Right? Yeah.
And the Colombian intelligence services actually provided all the receipts and the evidence to this, again, anti-Maduro paper who exposed the Guaido officials for this corruption. 2 of the opposition members that were there died because they were poisoned by prostitutes that they'd gone out and partied with in Colombia the night of the Venezuela Live Aid concert. Marco Rubio at the time tried to suggest that Maduro had poisoned these 2 guys. And then later the Colombian police come out with the report that they died because they'd been drugged and robbed by hookers. And then finally the USAID
killed them, huh?
Wow. They just OD'd them on whatever it was. And they took all their watches and their cash, and that was it. But
it's a little window into what an opposition-run Venezuela would look like.
Exactly. And then the USAID's own internal report basically said that the entire aid operation was a farce, that the State Department and the White House through the National Security Office tried to control every element of it for political gain. They said they tried to distribute aid based on how they could best support the opposition in terms of overthrowing Maduro, and that it had nothing to do with need. And that was the determination of the Inspector General of USAID's own report on the Venezuela aid incident. So exactly, that is a picture of what it would be like if those people ever took over Venezuela.
There's so much I would love more to talk with you about it, because as I've said already, you really do a great job of laying out the drier side of financial warfare. But it's extremely impactful. It kills people, and so it's really good journalism in that. And so because we're limited in time, we don't want to keep you forever. But I at least want to get one of these stories out before we let you go, if that's all right.
Of course.
The Citgo story,
yes.
And Citgo, if you're on the East Coast, I don't remember Citgo on the West Coast. John, do you, the gas stations? But when you're on the East Coast, Citgo's was. I don't know if they're around anymore. They were everywhere. It was a huge network of gas stations. And this was the American. Well, why don't you give a background on Citgo and then how Citgo was stolen and looted, and it's ongoing actually. So
Citgo's structure is actually key to understanding the scandal that I exposed. The Citgo conspiracy is what I called it, which is what I eventually determined to be at the heart of the shadow coup attempt that Trump waged and began in 2019. Because as I said, on its face, it was a joke. no one ever believed that Juan Guaido controlled the government. But as I began covering this story, I realized, okay, the recognition of the shadow government, even if they never expected to change the situation on the ground in Caracas, did provide the U.S. and its allies with the legal cover according to their own twisted courts and rules to then seize Venezuela's financial assets and steal from the country. So this happened in England, where the Bank of England, because Maduro had issued a repatriation request in September of 2018. Conveniently, then when England turned around and recognized
repatriation request for the gold that was held in the Bank of England. Yeah.
Yes, for gold that was held in the Bank of England in 2018. Conveniently, when London recognized Guaido as the president of Venezuela a few months later, they said, okay, we don't actually know who controls the government, so we are going to hold on to this gold indefinitely, which basically means it belongs to London now. That similarly happened in the United States, where we seized gold that was stored in Citibank, eventually moved it to an account controlled by the New York Federal Reserve, and it provided eventually the legal justification for what became the liquidation of Citgo Petroleum. And Citgo is Venezuela's largest international asset, worth upwards of $6 billion. It's not just gas stations. It's, if you've taken the Amtrak between DC and New York, you've seen the huge, giant Citgo refinery tanks along the East Coast. It's oil pipelines. It's the infrastructure that was established between the U.S. and Venezuela now for decades that allowed for us to import and refine their very heavy crude. It's a special kind of crude that Venezuela has, even though they have the most in the world. It's this very
heavy sour, right?
Yeah. And so it needs to go through a specific refining process. And we have the infrastructure for that because we've had this relationship with Venezuela all these years. And what happened with Citgo is that in the years leading up to the coup that saw the U.S. recognize Juan Guaido in Venezuela, multiple creditors or international corporations were suing Venezuela in international courts, basically the World Bank court, where states are at a severe disadvantage. I interview Andres Arauz, the former presidential candidate in Ecuador, who served as that country's economy minister for my book, and he describes the bank, the ICSID bank, where these cases are heard, as pretty much just run by agents of international capital. They're not allowed even to, they don't interpret the law of individual countries when they are looking at these cases. They're just reading the law according to the corporations and then ruling in favor of corporations and saying, look, now you can go claim a stake against these nations and try to seize their assets. And that is what happened in the case of Venezuela. Several creditors, including these two companies, Crystalex, which is a gold company.
Canadian. Or is it American or Canadian? Oh, it's Canadian. Yeah.
Canadian. And Owens, Illinois, an American glass company, were among these companies that were suing the Venezuelan state over repatriation that had taken place under Chavez. So Crystalex had gained access to exploit a gold mine in Venezuela that was eventually stopped by Venezuelan courts because they decided to nationalize that gold mine and develop the gold themselves. Crystalex never actually built the mine. They never operated it. The mining, the deal was canceled before it even got to up and running.
Right.
But Crystalex claimed that they were owed upwards of $1 billion because of Venezuela's decision to nationalize its mine. And then the issue is that
basically, like it had a concession that it would have added like $1 billion plus value to the company, and that was taken away from them. And and as you point, I mean, look, again, this court is based in Washington, D.C., and it's a subsidiary of the World Bank. Yeah. And so that tells you what you need to know. But but the problem is
they can get this. They won the ruling.
Right.
The court gives them the rubber stamp and says, okay, yes, Venezuela owes you $1 billion, but how are you going to get the Venezuelan government to pay? You can't.
Right.
Unless you go after their assets in U.S. courts, which is exactly what these companies did. They said, okay, Nicolas Maduro is not going to write us a check for $1.6 billion or whatever the court awarded. But Citgo Petroleum belongs to Venezuela. That's based in the United States. How about through the courts here, I claim a stake and say, because Venezuela owes me this money, you have to seize Citgo and give us or liquidate Citgo and use it to pay us back. And that court case was underway when the U.S. recognized this shadow administration in Venezuela. And immediately, Juan Guaido appoints a man named Jose Ignacio Hernandez to work as his quote-unquote attorney general, basically the top legal representative of Venezuela, according to U.S. law now, right? So it doesn't matter, again, that they didn't change the government in Venezuela. If the U.S. says that they recognize Juan Guaido and Jose Ignacio Hernandez as the Venezuelan government, that's what's going to play in U.S. courts.
Right. And Hernandez now is as the quote unquote attorney general of the government recognized in the US, he's supposed to represent the interests of the Venezuelan state, in this case, against or Crystal X. In theory, right.
In theory. But then it comes out that Jose Ignacio Hernandez had actually worked for Crystal X in the case that they'd waged against the Venezuelan government. He was a witness that had testified on behalf of Crystal X, and not only Crystal X, but Owens, Illinois as well. And I found court documents showing that he had been paid $163,000 by Owens, Illinois for that testimony. So he was on the payroll of the companies that were suing Venezuela in court when he, in fact, was supposed to be defending Venezuela in those very courts. And so what happened is members of the Venezuelan opposition reached out to me, not people connected in Maduro's government. In the opposition reached out to me because they were so upset about this conflict of interest. And they explained to me how Jose Ignacio Hernandez had upended Venezuela's legal defense against the creditors in U.S. courts because Citgo, yes, it's a subsidiary of PDVSA, the state-owned oil company in Venezuela. But there were several steps, leadership barriers between the head of PDVSA, the Venezuelan government, and the actual company in the United States. And that is, PDVSA appointed a board that then appointed Citgo Petroleum's board in the United States. It wasn't as if the Venezuelan government or the president sat there and directed the day-to-day operations of Citgo. And the reason that this is important is because in order to gain access to Citgo and liquidate the company in order to get their money, they had to prove that Citgo wasn't just an American corporation, but that it was actually an alter ego of the Venezuelan government, that there was no separation between the two entities. And therefore, if the Venezuelan government owed you money, it was okay to take it from Citgo.
Which is a hard thing to prove, I think, because courts generally, the corporate world doesn't want that precedent established too much, because all corporations around the world and states and everything use these structures specifically to protect assets, right? So if you peel this open somewhere, you might set a precedent and everybody could be vulnerable.
Right. So PDVSA, the president only appointed the board of PDVSA. PDVSA's board then selected the board of the Delaware subsidiary PDVSA Holding, which then chose the board of Citgo in the United States. Well, no, then Citgo Holding appointed the final board of Citgo Petroleum.
Right. So there's several layers.
Yes. So there was a separation between the Venezuelan state and the company.
Which I'm sure Venezuela's and Citgo's lawyers set that up specifically because there's a lot of precedent that gives it protection, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And that protection remained in place until February 2019, when Juan Guaido, immediately after getting recognized as Venezuela, directly appointed the board of Citgo Petroleum. He did that. He immediately, again, within days of taking office, this is one of the first things he did, is named a whole new board of Citgo, of people based in the United States. And that, according to the opposition officials that eventually reached out to me, was a major error made, well, not an error, a step taken by Guaido at the behest or at the allowance of Jose Ignacio Hernandez, that then proved the case of the companies that had paid him to testify on their behalf in court.
So as immediately, so we recognize Guaido, and the first thing Guaido does is a move that no company would ever, or state would ever want to do, which was set a legal precedent, or do something that would allow legally for somebody to be able to seize Citgo's assets, which is to directly intervene as the quote unquote head of state in naming the board. So then you could say, oh, wait a minute, the government, which is some guy who rides a motorcycle, just actually did directly appoint these people. So now we can seize it. Yeah.
Yep.
Amazing.
And I cite the court document in my book. Within days, Crystalex goes to the court in Delaware and says, Juan Guaido did this. Juan Guaido did this. He directly appointed the board of Citgo. And guess what? Who testified for Crystalex that Citgo was, in fact, an alter ego of the Venezuelan government? Jose Ignacio Hernandez.
The attorney general who was opposing it, supposedly. Yeah.
So I mean,
what
the people that
the
people that I spoke to, they say this man should be disbarred from the American. He should not be allowed to practice law in the United States. I mean, what he did was so blatant that forget about the crimes against Venezuela. It was just naked. Yeah. I mean, there's court documents naming him as a witness. When would that ever be acceptable in any other context for him to then take over as the lawyer? I mean, apply this in any other case.
Yeah.
Like, he testified that like I stole a cookie, but but now he's going over to defend the company that I'm trying to steal from. Like, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, I don't think that analogy actually works, but anyway, you get it. You get it.
Yeah. No, it's having Citgo, people rating Citgo on both sides of the court case. Right?
Yeah.
Is basically it.
And so now here we are in 2026, which I got right this time around. And fast forward, all the courts have ruled that Citgo, because of the legal maneuvering they made, Citgo is an alter ego of the Venezuelan state. It's getting liquidated in order to pay back all of these evil creditors. And so who's going to come in now and buy the infrastructure in a fire sale? Citgo's assets are now going to be sold off in a fire sale. And so these vultures can come in and pick at the carcass. We now have found out that Paul Singer, of all people, is stepping forward and plans to buy Citgo, or what's left of it. And he happens to be one of the top donors of Marco Rubio, our current Secretary of State, who has consolidated this policy under Trump. So, just in case you guys wanted to talk about Zionist billionaires, we can do that in the context of Venezuela.
They're always going to come up, aren't they? Yeah, I mean, big time Zionist billionaire. I mean, an interesting factoid about Paul Singer, he's the guy that first funded the Russiagate dossier, Christopher Steele's.
That's so true. I forgot about that.
Yeah, before he switched over to Trump because Trump won. And then that Steele dossier, job got picked up by the Hillary campaign. But he's the one who first started it. But yeah, it's funny, when you see like Nick Fuentes saying, our oil, basically out there supporting it. Nick Fuentes is fronting for Paul Singer, uber Zionist billionaire. It's what a joke, right?
It is. It is a joke. And but the one positive thing I can say in all of this is that the Trump admin has just made it so naked.
Yes.
Like, you can see how the Biden people are so upset because it's kind of taken all of their phony human rights positioning and just smashed it.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, let's stop pretending it's about any of that, guys. They would have loved to have made this same deal some way, or seen Maduro go and probably even put Delcy in place. I'm sure the Democrats would have loved it.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't like the way that Trump has gone about it. But the way that Trump has gone about it has taken any question or obfuscation of the issue off the table. Like, we can see very clearly what the agenda is, and Venezuelans can too. There's none of this. There's no guise. There's no ruse. It's just, it's plain
off,
to see.
Yeah, it's this total mask off. And the Democratic response generally has been like the so-called I get it populist, Chris Murphy. His whole thing is, you're doing this wrong. You're supposed to, there's a democratically elected opposition. Like, we should do this the right color revolution way. That's pretty much what most of the wherever there is opposition to this is. Every statement is like a 10-page testimony to how evil Maduro was and how he didn't belong there. And then like a paragraph condemning it as maybe unconstitutional, that it didn't follow the proper protocol and didn't end up with, a way that made us feel good. So there's just two shitty factions right now.
And you even had Maggie Brennan at Bari Weiss's CBS battering Rubio,
right?
Saying, "Why didn't you kill them all?"
Yeah. And Rubio was even like, "Are you kidding? So you want us to do this to 5 people? Like,
I know.
Well, you're a freak."
She managed to make him look good. That was crazy.
Yeah. What a fucking time. Anya, we'll let you go now because we've kept you here for a long time. There is, I recommend everybody, because we haven't even really talked about even more of the Alex Saab story, more about the Gold story, Operation Gideon, which is quite the
fun
farce.
Stuff.
There's a lot in that book, and it's all extremely relevant now. So get Anya's book, Corporate Coup. Anya Parampil, thank you so much for coming on Radio War Nerd.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, that was our interview with Anya Parampil. We'll post links to her book, and really appreciate her coming on and taking all the time talking with us. And anyway, John, great year ahead of us. But, thanks again, everyone. Thanks,
everybody.
Yeah, Brandon and our subscribers, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.